Hi, everyone, and welcome to another webinar by Lift Our Voices. I'm Gretchen Carlson, one of the co-founders, along with Julie Roginsky, the other co-founder of Lift Our Voices. And we welcome you and thank you so much for joining us for a really important discussion today about men as allies. So how did we get involved in all of this work? Well, maybe some of you remember that 9.5 years ago already, I decided to come forward at Fox News about sexual harassment. I had no idea that that was a part to advocate for getting rid of silencing mechanisms like forced arbitration and NDAs that cause these kinds of issues to be hidden, quite honestly, for years and years and push people out of the workforce who have the courage to come forward. So Julie and I got together and we formed Lift Our Voices, and we have been advocating and doing tons of work on these issues ever since. Julie?
Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Roginsky, also one of the co-founders of Lift Our Voices. So wonderful to have you all here. As Gretchen mentioned, she went first, jumped off the cliff at Fox News. I followed suit about 10 months later, and we came together because we understand the pernicious influence that forced arbitration and NDAs and other silencing mechanisms have on people in the workplace. And we are dedicating our lives to making sure that nobody else has to go through what we went through, and we are having tremendous success doing it. So we want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we're excited, so excited to have this talk today with Ted Bunch and Michael Smerconish.
So let's just do a quick definition check on the issues that we focus on. So Emily, if you can throw up the definition of forced arbitration, we can get started there. So arbitration. A forced arbitration clause sends your complaint into a private chamber away from public view. Lose your right to a public trial. An arbiter, often chosen by your employer, decides your fate behind closed doors. The deck is stacked against you from the start. And who does this affect? We're going to look at who this really affects. It affects most of us in the workplace. In fact, this year alone, 84% of us will all be under forced arbitration, and most of us will have no idea that we have signed away this right. But look at the other stats. It affects mostly people who make minimum wage. 65% of those people are forced into arbitration. It also affects women more than men, and of course, people of color more than non-people of color. So in other words, the more disenfranchised you may be in society, the more disenfranchised and silenced you are at work. Julie?
The other pernicious, Emily, if you could throw that up, the other pernicious silencing mechanism that we fight against is non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, which is basically a legally binding agreement between two or more parties that prevents information from being shared with others. You may think when you sign an NDA that you're protecting some proprietary information like the secret formula to Coca-Cola, for instance, but they have become so broad over the last 30 years. They include everything, including toxic behavior. And it's not just non-disclosure agreements, it's also non-disparagement agreements that prevent you from sharing your views about the way that you were treated. And so more and more, these agreements don't just cover trade secrets and other really proprietary information, but also include all sorts of information that should be able to be discussed. For instance, if you are harassed or discriminated against at work, you should be able to talk to your coworkers or your mother or your father or your husband or your wife or even a priest, a rabbi, or a therapist about this. But increasingly, they have become so expansive over the last 30 years that you're prevented from talking about anything that happens to you at work whatsoever. And those are the kinds of mechanisms that we're fighting against.
But we've made so much progress. So let's talk about the two federal laws that we have passed briefly. The Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act, known as the EFAA, signed into law in March 2022. So if you experience sexual misconduct in the workplace, you no longer have to be forced into arbitration, but you need to know about the law. 8 months later, we passed, bipartisan, by the way, both of these laws, the Speak Out Act, signed in December 2022. This bans pre-dispute NDAs that silence workers before misconduct occurs. Again, only sexual misconduct, but we are on the warpath for other protected classes. Julie?
And we also have been instrumental in helping to pass several state laws. The first was in New Jersey. New Jersey was the first state in the nation to ban non-disclosure agreements for all toxic workplace issues, which means that if you work in New Jersey right now and something bad happens to you, you can go ahead and talk about it. The court there also expanded that law to include non-disparagement agreements, which is really critical. California went next on January 1st, 2022. California enacted the Silence No More Act, which expanded their law to include a ban on NDAs for all toxic workplace issues as well. And then Washington State, a few months later, passed their Silence No More Act, really the crown jewel of these state efforts in order to make sure that nobody can be silenced anymore with respect to NDAs and non-disparagement agreements with silence around toxic workplace issues. Now, we are working very hard in states like New York and Connecticut to expand these laws. Can you just imagine if this law passed in New York with all of the financial institutions here, with all of the commerce here in New York? There would be a massive domino effect, as there was even in a little state like Washington, because although Washington is a small state, it has a lot of very, very, very important corporations. One of them is Microsoft. And when this law passed in Washington, Microsoft made sure that not only their workers in Washington state were no longer subjected to NDAs, which of course is the law there, but expanded it to all of their workers around the globe. And this is the kind of domino effect that states can have, not just for their own residents, but for people all around the country, if not around the world. And we're fighting very hard to make sure that if the federal government won't do it, we're going to enact this in all 50 states to make sure that you no longer can be silenced at work about bad things that happen to you.
Now that we laid the groundwork of what we do, it's time to introduce our esteemed guests for today. Julie?
Our first guest is Michael Smerconish. He needs no introduction, but Michael, thank you so much for being here. Michael is the host of a daily radio program heard nationwide on Sirius XM's POTUS channel. Tune into it, it's fantastic. He's also the host of CNN's Smerconish, which airs Saturdays at 9 a.m. Eastern. He also launched the Mingle Project as part of his mission to restore civility and compromise to our public discourse in our increasingly polarized society. Amen, Michael. Ted Bunch is an author, educator, activist, and lecturer working to advance gender and racial justice and create a more equitable society. Ted is co-founder of the nonprofit A Call to Men and is internationally recognized for his efforts to prevent violence against women while promoting a healthy, respectful manhood. He is a leading voice on issues of manhood, male socialization, promoting healthy manhood and masculinity, preventing violence against all women and girls, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and promoting gender and racial equity. And we are so honored to have both Ted and Michael here. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
So Michael, let me start with you. You've talked on your show a lot about men needing to rediscover a sense of code, a standard for integrity and accountability. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm worried about our young men. And by extension, I'm worried about our young women, because I think each needs the other for society to be healthy and to thrive. Whether it's anecdotal information or whether it's the data about education, data about employment, data about mental health spiking, meaning concerns, I think there are a whole host of reasons to be worried that men today are far more rudderless, young men, than they've been in the past. I don't view it, I should say at the outset, as a zero-sum game. I am married to a strong woman, and I am the son of a strong woman, who, by the way, will turn 90 on Saturday, knock on wood. So I know what it's like to be in the company of strong women, and I don't think that one group necessarily doing better in education, doing better in employment, doing better in any of the metrics is at the expense of the other. Having said that, I just think that there's a problem going on with men today, and that it's spilled into the world of political violence, brought on by a number of factors that include the polarization of society, by income inequality that is among us. And I think that it might not be politically correct to talk about what are we going to do for our men, but it's a conversation that is necessary, and by extension to make sure that women remain in a good place. One final thing, because I don't want to get long-winded, but what was an epiphany moment for me was back at the time of the Harris nomination and the Democratic National Convention, when I got to look at the DNC platform, and there was a particular section of it that said, here's who we represent. And virtually every affinity group, including women, were actually named, but there was no such recognition for men. And I said to myself, men need champions right now. It's a shame that the DNC feels like they can't put on equal platform with these other groups the plight of our men. So I guess in simplistic terms, that's where I'm coming from.
I think it's such an important conversation, Michael, and I've heard you talk about it many, many times, which is why I wanted you to be on this webinar. With regard to our issues that we described at the top, how do you think workplace silencing through NDAs and forced arbitration undermine that code that you talk about and shape the way that men might show up at work?
Well, it probably promotes bad conduct by men, and that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing for men, and it's obviously not a good thing for women. I'm an attorney. I never practiced employment law, but I've always believed that forcing people into arbitration was a terrible thing. And for the chief reason of, I believe in the sunlight that comes from having a day in court and having a jury of your peers, truly a collection of your neighbors in a particular community, sit with public being present if they choose to. Another beef of mine is that we don't permit cameras in all courtrooms, including the Supreme Court of the United States. Don't want to get off on that tangent. Mm-hmm. But I think that keeping people accountable is of critical importance, and there's nothing like a trial, a public trial, for accountability purposes.
Thank you for that. Julie?
Ted, you've said the way we raise boys defines the kind of men they become. And how does teaching them to equate manhood with dominance, or quote unquote being the protector, fuel the same culture of silence that harms both men and women? I mean, Ted, you've said that a real man is one who stands up for women. I have a 13-year-old boy that I'm trying to raise to be a good man. Gretchen has a young man as a son as well. So for all of us out there who care about young men and boys and making sure that they grow up to be wonderful men who are supportive of women, in addition to obviously being just good human beings. How do you do that? How do you teach them to equate manhood with something positive and not with dominance?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And most importantly, happy birthday to Mama Smerconish.
Thank you for that, Ted.
It's wonderful to hear. 90 years is amazing. I hope she has a wonderful day. So the work of A Call to Men, we're a national organization that focuses on violence prevention, eradicating sexism, and promoting healthy, respectful manhood. And our vision is to create a world where all men and boys are loving and respectful, and all women, girls, and those in the margins are valued and safe. And as I said, we do that through promoting healthy masculinity. So when we look at our boys, we really have to look at the socialization that they're a part of and how we pass things down from one generation to the next. And there's many wonderful things we pass down as men, but there's things that are harmful not only to women, girls, and LGBTQ, trans, and the non-conforming community, but also the men and boys. So when we talk about protector, teaching our boys to be protectors, like that's a wonderful thing to do. I want my sons, I have sons also, and they're adult men now, but I want them to be protectors. And I wanted them to be protectors when they were younger also, protectors of their younger siblings, for example. But not to put the pressure on them to be men when they're still boys, right? So the protection is an important piece. When I talk to high school students, even college students, boys in particular, and I ask them, who, with your parents, who protects, when you think about protection, do you think about your mother or you think about your father? I have to say, more boys say their mother than their father, that they feel who's protected them. So we often equate protection to something men do, where women do it as well, but we don't acknowledge what women do. We're silent about what women do. In the same way, Michael, that you mentioned, and I really appreciate you bringing it up, that that men are feeling left out, right? That there's kind of this default because of entitlements and privileges and patriarchy and male-dominated society. There's a default that's kind of given that, well, men are provided for, men have what they need, those kind of things. But we're at the point now where that's really that men aren't feeling that way. They're feeling marginalized in some ways, right? They're losing things. And they do, I think, from my experience, see it as a zero-sum game. And as you say, it's not. So when we look at the socialization of men and how we pass that down to our boys, we really have to always be inviting men in and not indicting men for being men, or being raised as men, and inviting our boys in as well, and not necessarily calling men out, but calling men in. That's the way to create some sort of a real lasting change, that we're all swimming in the same water. So I think that men are just misinformed in many ways, and it has a lot to do, obviously, with what patriarchy means, what male-dominated society means, and what sexism is, and how that's passed down and kind of embedded into the socialization of our boys. So that's what we see. And we see it online even more so, because there's some very strong and angry voices out there that are blaming women for all the challenges that men have. If there's not economic opportunity, it's because women have the jobs. If it's not romantic opportunity, it's the fault of women. So there's things that we need to unpack with men that are just false. And so I'm happy to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. So Back to you, Michael. We're seeing that epidemic of male loneliness, fewer friendships, more isolation, often a sense that men can't open up or ask for any help. How do we start to rebuild these connections, not just between men, but between men and women in the workplace especially? And how can allyship be a bridge to that kind of community and trust?
I guess by starting with what's causing the problem and from where does it spring. I don't solely fault technology, but I largely fault technology. A book that really made an impression on me was Jean Twangy's iGen, written a couple of years ago. In fact, at a time when she was speaking in terms of correlation, not causation. But she studies generations. She's a psychologist from San Diego. And in studying generations, she noted that something happened in 2012. It became a tipping point. She realized that in 2012, more than half, for the first time, of us had a smartphone. It was the year that Facebook acquired Instagram. It was the start of the selfie era. And that she saw correlation between steep spikes in mental health problems for our kids, both men and women, at a time when technology now was the means by which social lives of adolescents became the platform. She revisits these subjects in subsequent books, much like Jonathan Haidt with The Anxious Generation. And now they don't speak in terms of correlation, they speak in terms of causation. When I was a young man, when Ted was a young man, and obviously this applies to men and women, but we didn't have technology working against us. You know, we had all the stressors of adolescence, but now I think it's gotten much, much worse because these algorithms seem to have the number of so many of our kids, especially our young men. And whether it's the easily accessibility of online porn, whether it's gaming, whether it's understanding that rage is something that keeps people being very attentive. There's a technology, I'm not expert, by the way, I'm just an informed dad. And there's a technology aspect to driving us apart from one another that I think needs to be recognized and dealt with. And Gretchen mentioned, and Julie mentioned, you know, the Mingle project that I'm involved with. It's my sole attempt to reestablish common experience, because I think what we most lack as a society are places where we go, where we are in the company of people who are different than we are by gender, by race, by income, and we lack the common purpose and the sense of we're in this together that comes from that common experience. So that's my solution. My solution is let's figure out how we can engage and be joiners in our communities and establish social capital, as Robert Putnam would say, in a bowling alone mindset, much like our parents. I mean, I look at the way my parents lived their lives when I was younger that I never fully appreciated, but the level of engagement that they had in their communities, I think did a heck of a lot to bring us together as a society. And now we're self-sorting, and technology is making that much easier.
It's such a great point. Ted, I also want you to respond to that. What is your solution to the loneliness?
Yes, so it's huge, and I agree with Michael that, you know, the online presence, the online attention that many of our boys are always on their phone or on video games, right? They're not going out inside and playing as Michael and I would have to do. So the issue of loneliness, the sense of belonging or the lack thereof, being isolated, you see a lot of pain in our boys. And that pain shows up in many different ways. You see it from school shootings to all these other things that happen. Our boys are in pain and they're not being paid attention to. So the algorithm that was mentioned a moment ago, you know, I think about, there was one of the most popular phrases or terms that young men look at, teen boys in particular, is what is it to be a man? And so these messages come to them through the algorithm that they've now opened up to. And as I mentioned before, there's some strong, charismatic, and aggressive voices that are also very misogynistic voices. And that's what comes in first. And then voices like a call to men or something promoting more caring, respectful manhood, you know, does not get the same attention because the numbers are not the same. So that's what the boys continue to go down this rabbit hole, and they're being taught this version of manhood that's really not balanced. It's not respectful of valuing women or girls or the queer community at all. And it's also one that is full of male dominance. So I have a neighbor whose son kind of went down this rabbit hole a few years back, and he's come out of it. And we call it the manosphere, right? He's come out of it. But one thing that happened during him coming out of that, because once he realized how much he was being monetized by it, once he came out of that, she said something. She said, as difficult as it was for some of his beliefs that he was sharing with us, he did make his bed in the morning. He started looking for a job. So there's something that's resonating. There's something that's positive. There's something that we need to really appreciate with that these boys are being reached. But the message is, and from my view, harmful. So when we look at the algorithm, I think that's something that we really need to hope for influencers who really have a following, who can also become ambassadors for messages such as that of a call to man and other positive messages.
Can I throw in that I would echo what Ted has said, and something that concerns me greatly is the origin of relationships. I'll say it this way: I'm a product of an age where there was something called a date, and a date would necessitate that I would go to the phone in the kitchen. It may have been a rotary dial. It may have been a push button. And I would have to push that phone and live in fear that, as I would put it, the old man was going to answer the phone, and I would have to talk my way through him in order to get to her. But there were so many things that were learned, including rejection, in that process. And today it seems like, technology is what gets it done without any kind of the social interaction that preceded the point where you'd even want to have an encounter with somebody. And I don't mean physical. I just mean, to be in the company of someone. And I worry in particular about the influence of pornography creating an expectation in the minds of young men who've not been raised properly, who've not had social interaction, and now, how do I say this, don't treat women with the level of dignity and respect with which they ought to be treated, because all they know is what they saw on a screen that's brought them some completely unrealistic image of the way the world works. That's an additional way, I think, that technology is really influencing in a bad way young minds.
That's I think you're absolutely right about that. And to follow up, in terms of bridging divides, Michael, you've interviewed countless leaders across the political spectrum. We were just talking about this before we came on air. And given the bipartisan support behind our mission and behind our wins, the Ending Forced Arbitration Act and the Speak Out Act, what lessons can you share with us about bridging divides in this broader conversation about gender equity and culture?
Well, what you've done is amazing.
Thank you.
It's really a hell of an achievement that in a world where the government, as we speak, is now 3+ weeks into a shutdown, to be able to get anything done with bipartisan support. I think the issues in the conversation that we've had thus far generate universal appeal. I mean, who could be opposed to anything that the four of us are speaking about on the subject of the divide and the self-sorting and the need to reestablish common experience? I speak extensively all across the country. In addition to the radio and television responsibilities, Gretchen was very kind in being a guest of mine on one of my Mingle Project videos on YouTube, which are solely intended to try and have the conversation about putting us back as a society. That's really not a direct answer to your question. I guess what I would say is, I think if you can get to the right people, they'll understand this is one of those issues where we can all work together and doesn't have to be subject to the far left, far right divide as everything else. This is common ground.
Appreciate that, Michael. And it was so true when we went to meet with legislators. You never knew who you were going to get, right? So I think another big lesson is, and I talked about this with you on your Mingle show, is that you can't just automatically assume that people on the right or people on the left are going to be opposed to what you're talking about. You have to welcome them in and see where they are. And in many cases, I found people who were supporters that I would have never guessed would have been supporters of our issues. So it's really just about coming together and having conversation and trying to bridge that gap originally back to your old-fashioned way, which actually works. So Ted, you often say that the man box traps men as much as it traps women. how can breaking that box, challenging the kind of old definitions that we grew up with, help men find purpose, connection, and courage to speak out when they see wrongdoing, especially in the workplace? Because I know we have some questions already in the chat about what can men do as bystanders. What do you think?
So the man box is all those things that you would think it is that are inside the man box, and not asking for help, being dominant, being aggressive, always being in control, being dominant, especially over women in your lives, being successful, being a protector, being a provider. Some very good things in the man box, but there's things that are also harmful, as I had mentioned before. So when we talk about the workplace, one of the things when you had the courage to take the legal stance that you did, Gretchen, a few years back, and then when Me Too emerged as a national conversation, it was very interesting to me because I'm doing work around, we've always been at a Carlson Man work in the space of sexual harassment in the workplace, knowing that the workplace is a microcosm of our greater society. So men come into the workplace as the men they've been taught to be. So really, addressing that, and what became clear to me in those moments, why there was men were back on their heels, just general men, good guys who are not sexually harassing people in the workplace, but we were all kind of back on our heels because from my perspective, we knew as men that we've been a part of this problem in one way or another, that our socialization is and has been, you have to objectify women to pass the test around manhood in a society that doesn't value women and sees women as sexual objects, right? And if you don't, other men are really ridiculing you because you're outside of the man box. If you're not objectifying women, they're ridiculing you and calling you names that push you back into the man box, because that man box, the glue that keeps that man box together is homophobia, right? It doesn't exist without homophobia. So it was really interesting to me way back then, as I'm talking to corporate spaces and so forth, that men were back on their heels because we know on some level we've all been a part of it in one way or another as boys or as adults or even in the workplace. So the things that we can do in the workplace to be partners is to really be aware of that, to advocate for equal opportunity for women, to advocate for equal pay for women, to understand that there's entitlements and privileges that are just silent, where, we have AI that takes recordings for us in meetings now, but, not too many years ago, if men were in a meeting with their peers and women were their peers and somebody needs to take notes, very few men who are raising their hand to take the notes. They're expecting that the woman's going to take the note, right? Those kinds of things, that the coffee needs to be there, and they're expecting that, a woman's going to take care of that in one way or another. So it really is understanding that our culture, that our entitlements, that we do, our default setting is men in any male-dominant society. That's what it is. That's what the default setting is. So we often then blame women for the things that men do. I remember in 2021 or so, this corporate space had totally changed their setup. There weren't closed doors. They now had glass from the floor to the ceiling. I had good men who were never, well-meaning men, I should say. I don't want to say good or bad, but well-meaning men in the workplace, again, who have never sexually been inappropriate in the workplace, but who were saying, I'm not going to close my door. I'm not going to close my door if a woman's in my office, as if when the door was closed, women were the problem, right? When the door was closed, it wasn't women who were the problem. So those are the lenses we see things through. So we have to understand that's kind of how we see things as men, and we need to be aware of that.
I want to ask a question that comes to us in the chat from Keith Renner Brennan, who we have spoken to before. And Renner asks, as a male survivor of corporate sexual harassment and assault by an SVP, both myself as well as my direct report, how can men like me be part of an allyship, not just as bystanders, but as voices for change? I lost my job as a result of reporting it. And I just want to say that this is a constant refrain we get, mostly from women, but also over the course of the last 6 years or 5 years that we've been running Lift Our Voices, from men as well. When you do the right thing and you stand up for others as well as for yourself, you sometimes are the person who gets penalized. Yeah. So I'll start with you, Michael. How can men be a voice for change to ensure that this doesn't happen and continue to happen?
First of all, we need to be present, and I mean physically present because as I was listening to Ted and agreeing with what he had to say, I was thinking about the workplace today not being the workplace in which I was participating before doing the things that I'm doing today, practicing law, namely. I'm worried about the lack of socialization that comes when we're all disparate, when we're all working from home, or so many of us are working from home, because there's a socialization, I think, that is healthy when we're together and when there are norms that are established by people who can be role models. I'm not saying it clearly, but it's harder to be a role model for a young man, or for anybody else for that matter, if you're not physically together. And today, where we're doing everything from home, we're shopping from home, we're eating from home, we're working from home, we're not going to movies because instead we're watching a flat screen television, et cetera, et cetera. We're just not together. And I think that bad behavior is then emanating more from the influence of the internet and online cultural influences than it would when you have, I'll put it in male terms, a buddy with whom you can speak at the office who's in a position to say, no, that's not right, and that's not how you want to behave. So if we're not physically together, it makes it much more difficult, I think, to police the kind of behavior that we're opposed to.
Ted, I want to ask you that same question because, you know, after I came forward and I started writing my book, Be Fierce, I never intended to do a chapter about men, but there were so many well-meaning men, to use your phrase, who reached out to me and said, I'm one of the people who's trying to help. And in my unscientific study of walking down the streets of New York City, more men than women stopped me to say thank you. Thank you for my wife. Thank you for my niece. Thank you for my daughter. Thank you for my granddaughter. And I was like, wow, like men want to help. Yeah. They want to be our allies. And so I dedicated a whole chapter to men who defend. Yeah. And yet, when men help women in the workplace, they get punished like women do who have the courage to come forward. And Keith is an example of that. And there are countless other people who've reached out to me where they've also been penalized. So how do we bring everyone together to be able to stand up for each other? I know that I'm answering the question in my own head, like we need to have leaders who are men who will not penalize people and will set that tone from the top on down. But what do you think about that?
I agree. It has to be leadership within the organization, within the company, but whether it's sexual harassment in the workplace or violence in our communities, most sexual harassment, though men also are victims of sexual harassment, but most sexual harassment is really in the same way that most violence against women is done by men. But most men don't do those things, but we're silent about those that do. And that's as much of the problem as the violence and abuse or the harassment is. Even more of the problem, perhaps, because the only way men do it is because we know that other men aren't going to necessarily say anything about it, because we're taught that, again, part of our socialization, that women and girls have less value than men and boys. And on some level, women are here to, again, in a patriarchal society, here to serve men, and that they're not as important as men. So there's this silence that we have as men that's, again, woven into our socialization. And again, this is not an indictment on manhood, but an invitation to men. And when I talk about it being woven into our socialization, it's things we don't see. It's things that we don't hear. And then when truth tellers like yourself come forward, men do say, yeah, I'm not in agreement with that. Of course, I'm not in agreement with that. And so we need to use our influence and our platform in the workplace to express that in a way that's respectful, in a way that kind of brings people in. And, you know, there's some risk involved, of course, but there's people within the organization or the company who have influence who need to utilize that and really show leadership in that way, and others will step forward. We do a lot of things. There's a lot of things that you can do within the workplace, even though much of it is online, as Michael's saying, that gives messaging around promoting healthy, respectful workplaces, right? There's things we've helped organizations and restaurants, actually, when there was some sexual harassment with some of the service staff, where we've created language that goes above the urinals in the men's room around messaging around healthy, respectful behavior, and that it's not tolerated here. And if you see something, you hear something, please, let so-and-so know, whoever that is in the organization.
As long as the management actually goes along with what's above the urinal.
Right.
Because the problem is, as
You're
we
right.
have found out, is, as I said earlier, the tone is set from the top, and 95% of Fortune 500 companies are run by men. That's why we wanted to do this webinar. Like, we are reaching out to you with the olive branch. We're not one of these women's organizations that says, hey, we don't include men. We need men. They have to understand our issues to be able to help us. And that can be over the urinal all day long. But if the guy sitting at the top does not agree with it and is still going to penalize people and silence them with forced arbitration and NDAs, you can't win that game. And so this is why we attack this from so many different angles. We pass laws, we educate, we try to bring together groups like we're doing today. I mean, the biggest thing is changing the hearts and minds of leaders to get rid of these cultural stereotypes where we penalize people who have the courage to come forward. Okay, off my soapbox. Julie.
That's good.
Well, I just want to add one thing to your soapbox. To your point, I remember when I was still at Fox, after I filed my sexual harassment lawsuit against the network, I had to go through, which everybody else did, through sexual harassment training. And I remember sitting in that training, kind of having a very out-of-body experience, thinking it's all great to have these kinds of trainings and to tell people what not to do. But again, if at the top of the food chain, that's not being taken particularly seriously, that then becomes problematic. So I want to just add my voice to that, and to do that. I just want to ask both of you, effectively, you know, we have often talked about, and Michael, I'll start with you, how transparency is at the center of what we do, lift our voices. You alluded to this in the very beginning of our talk, where you said that sunlight is the best disinfectant in politics or in the courts or wherever else you want cameras, which I fully agree with you. But how can that same principle apply in the workplaces where obviously things are not as high profile as they would be politically or they would be at the Supreme Court?
Right, but if bad behavior is not policed in the workplace, then the bad behavior committed against someone is going to be committed against them, against someone else by that same perpetrator. I mean, I'm saying what I guess is obvious, but there's a necessity here in the same way that if it were outside the workplace and you had someone who was committing wrongdoing in a community, they'd become a repeat offender. You're going to have a repeat offender within the workplace unless that person is dealt with. And that's the case for the need for transparency and accountability. So I see exterior to the workplace and that which goes on in the workplace through a similar lens.
Interesting. Ted, do you have any thoughts on that? Because again, we always talk about transparency, but right when it comes down to it, if you work at a small business or you work at a major conglomerate, still HR and other places exist. You know, HR, we always say exists not necessarily to protect you, it exists to protect the company. That's their job. And so how do you translate that kind of transparency that we always advocate for to inside a workplace where it's kind of stacked against you to some extent because the structure exists to protect the workplace and not necessarily the survivor? Yeah.
Well, Gretchen's point is well taken about the leadership, right? That's really important, that the leadership really sets the tone. But the workplace is also a community. And I would look at it from our community organizing background, which is in the community, how can we have conversations even around what would make the workplace the best positive experience for everyone, right? And to get some feedback, even if it's a survey, and getting some feedback around that. And I would encourage to have conversations with men in the organization to say, hey, these are some things that people experience in the workplace, women experience in the workplace, men experience in the workplace. And we want to prevent these things from happening here. What do you think about it? And get feedback and input from those men. And you're going to find people that really have more of an investment because they're part of the community and I would think want to be a positive part of it.
It's an interesting point you bring up, Ted, because actually one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got for bridging the gap was to have male executives invite women to lunch to see how their experience is different from what their own is. And the women may not agree to open up right away and vice versa, but this person told me that that was sort of like this opening of new understanding, because we do stay in our silos, and to your point, to the man box. So, Michael, any thoughts on whether or not you think that's a good idea, or how can people become, bridge that gap in a different way from what I just put
Well,
up?
I love what you just said. I'm not surprised by the merit of the lunch example, but in a word, dialogue. These things don't get solved unless you're willing to discuss them. They are capable of being discussed among adults in a respectful way where people are heard and feel as if they're seen and have had some input. And that's my solution for all of this. Be in person, have the conversation, be willing to explore in a civil manner the kind of controversies that need to be addressed, or they fester and they get worse. And people who are bad actors continue to do what they do. Openness and dialogue.
Yep.
That would be my answer.
All right, let's go to some other questions from people who submitted before we got on the air. So Ted, they say, your work reminds us that allyship isn't just about calling out bad behavior, it's calling men in. What does that look like in practice when they've made mistakes, but they want to do better?
Well, there has to be a road to redemption. There has to be. And if someone's willing to hold himself accountable to whatever that behavior is and to be responsible, then I think there's no better spokesperson. There's really no better person to address it than someone who has caused the harm once they've gone through the process of making good of that, whether it's a victim or whatever healing needs to occur there. So again, I think that it's really around meeting men where they are, not excusing behaviors. Men need to be held accountable. I'm saying men, but anyone needs to be held accountable who causes harm. And if they're willing to hold themselves accountable and be responsible, then I think that's the process for repair. So the work that I've done I founded the organization 23 years ago with Tony Porter, he's the CEO, I'm the Chief Development Officer still. And if I didn't believe in healing, in redemption, in that men want to be their best version of themselves, we just need to help them understand what that is and give them more information around it, I wouldn't be doing this work.
Michael, you often talk on your show and both your shows actually about the polarization in public life, and how can we have these hard conversations about gender and power without falling into the same cultural war traps, I guess, that stop progress?
So I try and do it every day on radio. There's a much more limited opportunity for live viewer input on television, but I believe you can have the conversations without playing to stereotype and without pursuing only a base that's at one end or the other of the political spectrum. I think that so few try because we reward the loudest voices in the room. That's a political statement more so than it is one that is particular to these concerns. But I think that there's a lot of overlap in it. And what we have to be willing to do is engage people who are somewhere not at the extremes, because you'll be rewarded if you do. I'm absolutely convinced that the vast majority of the country would be paying attention to this and would find it all to be so reasonable, so valuable, and so worthy. But too many others are looking for clicks and eyes on websites or television programs or calls to radio shows through incendiary means. We reward bad behavior. It's kind of set up now. And not only are the loudest voices rewarded, but so too are the politicians that they, through oftentimes closed primaries, get nominated and then win election in gerrymandered districts. And it's this vicious circle that needs to be broken. And the way to break it is to reach people who are independent in their thought process, because I think that's where most of the country is.
I have a follow-up question to that, if I can. We live kind of in an attention economy, right?
Right. Yeah.
As you said, we reward this kind of vitriol. How do we bring attention in this kind of attention economy to the issues that you're talking about, which is bipartisanship and kindness and having people talk to each other rather than at each other, when the algorithm is designed to punish that kind of thought and not reward it, when cable news ratings are designed to punish that and not reward it for the most part. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's a huge challenge to what we're all talking about here today.
Okay, Julie, I've not yet cracked that code, but damn, I'm trying. Okay, I'm trying. It's hard. It's hard. I mean, you think about the memes, right, that are getting the attention just in the last couple of days. I won't single them out, and it's the coarse behavior that is that which gets the attention. But I think what you have to do is try and disabuse people of the idea. This would be at the top of the list. Disabuse people of the idea that it's necessarily boring if you're not one of the extremists, right? I think I'd like to say that we're four interesting people having an intelligent conversation about issues that matter, and that this is worthy content. I think too many programmers believe, well, you've got to be one or the other, or we're not putting you on television or providing you with a microphone. So win the argument by being extroverted, engaged, hopefully speaking intelligently, and trying to disabuse people of the idea that you need to be way over there in order to be interesting and heard.
Totally agree with you, Michael. Totally agree with you. And by the way, I think it's more interesting when you're down the middle and want to bring people together, because when you're on television then and doing analysis, people don't know what you're going to say. Mm-hmm. And that's actually why they want to watch TV. They don't want to watch to hear people stick to their talking points 24/7. So that's what I think makes you interesting. I hope that's what people think makes me interesting. And Ted, you're always interesting. So I know you wanted to jump.
Sorry, we said we kept cutting you off. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to, I'm being really inspired by some of the things I'm hearing today. And that balance, Michael, I listened to your show because you're one of the more balanced voices, and I really appreciated that. And even the conversation you were having today online around that most people want the same thing, right? And so I agree with that. Like most people do, but we're kind of in our silos, and it's really being able to bridge that gap, meet people where they are, because even no matter what someone's political views are, with our work of A Call to Men around ending violence against women and girls in particular, whoever the father is, whether he's whoever side he's on, however he identifies, wants his daughter to be safe, right? Wants his son to be a respectful person. So we have to just educate and bring them from their heart to their head, which is kind of the long distance sometimes, and to be able to connect that and transfer that respect and value you have for your daughter to other women and girls in your community, other women and girls in the country, other young men as well. So those are the things that are, I think are really important, that there's much more in common than different, and we need to be able to elevate that.
Touche. I'm so glad that we could have this conversation today with both of you. Thank you so much for giving your time to lift our voices and for having this important discussion about how men can be allies with women and vice versa. Where can people find you, Michael?
Smerconish.com is sort of a clearinghouse. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. In line with this conversation, please find me on YouTube and watch my Mingle Project videos. We've rolled out 4. We're dropping number 5 tomorrow. Gretchen appears in the sort of the pilot, the first episode, and it was fabulous. And it's all about just trying to recreate common experience. That's the mission.
Great. And Ted?
Ted?
Yes, so I can be found on Instagram at ted.bunch, but most of our content is at A Call to Men, and that's on all of the social media channels at A Call to Men. And I just want to say thank you, Gretchen and Julie, for your wonderful leadership and vision, and just bringing all of who you are to this important issue. And thank you, Michael. Glad to be here with you as well.
Thank you all for having me.
Thanks very much, everybody.
And you can find us at liftourvoices.org. Thanks for a great conversation. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.